April 14, 1945. The North Sea was gray and cold, its waves rolling endlessly beneath a low ceiling of mist. Only a few weeks remained before Nazi Germany's collapse, but deep beneath those restless waters, one final patrol was still underway. U-1206, a brand-new Type 6C German submarine, slipped silently through the depths off the Scottish coast. Her commander, 41-year-old Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt, was on his first and only combat mission. The war above was ending in chaos, yet here, below the surface, discipline and secrecy still ruled. The boat carried 50 crewmen, engineers, radio men, mechanics, and sailors, each of them confined inside a steel tube no longer than 2 train cars. The U-1206 represented the peak of German submarine engineering, faster, tougher, equipped with new high-pressure systems, and an advanced on-board toilet system that was, ironically, far ahead of its time. That toilet, more complicated than some of the submarine's machinery, would soon become infamous as the device that doomed the boat. For now, though, everything was calm. U-1206 had left Kristiansand, Norway, on April 6, 1945, and was patrolling off the coast of Peterhead, Scotland. Its mission was straightforward: intercept Allied shipping and report coastal activity. But morale was low. The men could feel the end approaching. Radio intercepts hinted at German cities in ruins, the Allies pushing deep into the heart of Europe. Even so, orders were orders. The sea was quiet that morning. The hum of the diesel engines had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic pulse of electric motors as the submarine moved submerged. At periscope depth, the ocean's surface shimmered faintly above the lens. Captain Schlitt kept his eyes pressed to the scope, scanning for the enemy, but the North Sea seemed deserted. The Royal Navy was focused elsewhere. Deep within the narrow corridors, the crew worked through routine maintenance. Life on a submarine was monotony punctuated by terror. The air smelled of diesel, sweat, and machinery oil. There was no privacy. Hammocks hung wherever space allowed, and the only place one could ever be alone was inside the tiny toilet cubicle, a device so advanced that only specially trained men were allowed to operate it. The high-pressure toilet, as it was called, could discharge waste at great depths using compressed air and a precise valve sequence. One mistake, however, and seawater could rush in. Later, survivors would recall that the captain had insisted on using it himself that day, ignoring the mechanic's suggestion to wait. The war was nearly over, and pride still mattered. What followed was an accident so absurd it would become one of the strangest naval disasters of the war. When Schlitt operated the mechanism incorrectly, seawater flooded back into the chamber, mixing with the battery compartment beneath the deck. Seawater and sulfuric acid made a deadly combination: chlorine gas. Within seconds, a hissing chemical cloud spread through the compartments. Men began to cough and choke as the greenish vapor burned their lungs. The crew scrambled for gas masks, but the situation deteriorated fast. The submarine was still 150 feet below the surface. Poisonous air filled the control room. Schlitt ordered an emergency ascent. The compressed air tanks roared, ballast tanks blew, and the heavy vessel lurched upward toward the light. They broke the surface violently, waves crashing over the hull as men rushed to open the hatches for fresh air. But surfacing in daylight off the Scottish coast meant immediate danger. Above, Allied aircraft patrolled the area constantly. Any surfaced U-boat was a target. Still coughing from gas exposure, the crew began to ventilate the compartments. The decision had to be made quickly: try to repair the damage or abandon ship. The engines were flooded, communications were down, water was still rising through the lower decks. It was clear: U-1206 was lost. As the crew prepared to abandon ship, Captain Schlitt gave the order to scuttle the submarine. Charges were set. Papers were burned. The men climbed onto the wet deck as cold wind whipped across the North Sea. Within minutes, the charges detonated, and U-1206 slipped beneath the waves, taking its secrets and 3 of its crew with it. For decades, the story of U-1206 remained buried like the submarine itself, resting quietly at the bottom of the sea. It was officially a bizarre accident, a tragic consequence of over-engineering. But later discoveries would raise new questions. Why had the submarine been operating so close to shore? Why were sections of its interior sealed before it sank? And what were the unmarked crates that disappeared from the manifest before the mission began? What began as a toilet mishap soon turned into one of the most whispered-about mysteries in post-war naval history. For nearly 4 decades, U-1206 slept undisturbed in the cold darkness of the North Sea. The world moved on. The war had ended, Germany rebuilt, and those few who knew about the submarine's final mission grew old and died. The official record was clear. U-1206 sank on April 14, 1945, after a technical failure involving the onboard sanitation system. 3 men had perished, including one trapped inside when the hatch was sealed. The rest had been rescued or captured by British patrol boats. The incident was filed away as an engineering tragedy, embarrassing but hardly mysterious. But the sea keeps its own secrets. In the late 1970s, a group of Scottish fishermen trawling near Peterhead began reporting something strange. Their nets snagged on a solid object resting far below the surface. They assumed it was a rock outcrop or an old wreck. Then, one day, a torn net brought up a fragment of blackened steel, a curved piece with rivets and German markings still visible under layers of corrosion. The fragment bore a faint number, 1206. The discovery attracted the attention of maritime authorities and local historians. In 1976, a Royal Navy survey confirmed the presence of a submarine wreck at a depth of around 250 feet, lying at an angle on the seabed. The hull was largely intact. The bow faced northeast, as if it had been attempting to reach deeper water when it went down. Over time, the shifting currents had covered parts of it in silt, but much of the conning tower was still recognizable. Divers who visited the site in the early 1980s described it as eerily preserved. The hull, made of thick steel, had resisted corrosion better than expected. Some of the internal hatches were sealed, though others appeared forced open. The periscope was extended, suggesting the submarine had surfaced only moments before sinking. There were no visible signs of external attack, no torpedo holes, no depth charge damage. It seemed the story of the internal flooding was true, and yet several details didn't fit. In the forward section, divers found debris that looked out of place. Metal containers, unusual wiring, and fragments of equipment that didn't match standard U-boat schematics. More curious still, there were traces of unusual alloys not commonly used in wartime production. Some claimed they had found evidence of sealed crates that had been hastily welded down, as if to prevent access. The official dive report, later declassified, avoided mentioning these details, noting only cargo space consistent with storage modifications. Local rumors began to spread. Some said U-1206 hadn't been on a routine patrol at all. Others whispered that it had been carrying sensitive material or technology meant to be smuggled out of Germany as defeat loomed. The late war period had seen numerous desperate attempts by the Nazi regime to evacuate scientists, documents, and valuables by sea. Several other U-boats had been caught transporting gold, blueprints, and even uranium oxide. It wasn't impossible that U-1206 had a similar mission. Among the recovered artifacts was a corroded logbook cover, its pages mostly destroyed by decades underwater. Only fragments of handwriting survived, coordinates, depth readings, and a few cryptic notations that didn't match standard patrol logs. One partial entry, dated April 11th, mentioned a coded transmission. Commando Befehl 67A, orders confirmed. The code, historians later noted, corresponded to a secret directive issued to certain submarines in the final weeks of the war, the evacuation of special research material. But no one could prove what U-1206 had been carrying. As the wreck became known among divers, it gained a reputation. Some called it the ghost boat. Divers reported odd experiences, equipment malfunctions, distorted compass readings, and the unsettling feeling of being watched from the murky darkness. One diver claimed his camera failed the moment he entered the control room, only to start working again once he surfaced. Another reported hearing rhythmic tapping from somewhere within the hull, though the interior was sealed and empty. The site was eventually declared a war grave, and further dives were restricted. Still, the stories persisted. What had begun as a technical malfunction had grown into something larger, a piece of wartime folklore. And beneath the cold waters of the North Sea, the rusting hulk of U-1206 continued to rest, its secrets entombed in silence. But in the 1990s, new evidence surfaced. Literally. A storm off the Scottish coast unearthed more debris, including an object that would reignite the mystery, a sealed container that no one could immediately identify. The storm that struck the Scottish coast in November 1991 was one of the strongest in a decade. Waves as high as 20 feet battered the shoreline near Peterhead, tearing fishing lines, overturning boats, and disturbing the seabed where countless wrecks lay buried beneath layers of sand and silt. When the storm passed, it left behind more than wreckage. It revealed fragments from a forgotten war. 2 days later, a local trawler captain named Duncan Fraser brought in something strange. Among the usual catch of twisted metal and seaweed was a cylindrical object about 4 feet long, coated in rust but still tightly sealed. The surface bore faint traces of German writing, part numbers, inspection stamps, and a faded eagle insignia that was unmistakably from the wartime era. It had likely come from the wreck of U-1206. When news reached the authorities, the item was immediately confiscated. The Royal Navy's Explosive Ordnance Division assumed it was a leftover torpedo component or some kind of pressurized container, but after tests, they determined it wasn't explosive. The casing was unusually thick, made from a high-grade steel alloy with copper linings, materials often used for protecting sensitive equipment. Inside, when technicians finally opened it under controlled conditions, they found not explosives, but something far stranger. Layers of decayed paper, microfilm reels, and a series of thin metallic plates engraved with what appeared to be diagrams. Most of the contents were too damaged to decipher. The microfilm had fused into a solid mass from decades underwater. But what little could be recovered hinted at technical documentation. Drawings, formulas, possibly relating to radar or propulsion technology. Several pages, preserved in vacuum-sealed sleeves, bore the insignia of the Kiel Naval Research Institute, a top-secret facility that had been working on advanced submarine systems in the final months of the war. These findings, though partial, were enough to reignite speculation that U-1206's last mission had not been a simple patrol but a transport run, carrying experimental data or technology intended to reach Norway and perhaps beyond. The most intriguing discovery, however, wasn't the documents but the engraved plates. They seemed to form part of a device or control system, etched with geometric patterns and German technical labels. Independent experts brought in later suggested that they might have been related to sonar or magnetic detection systems. One phrase, faint but still legible, stood out on one of the plates. Project Nautilus, Versuchseinheit 4, Project Nautilus, Test Unit 4. No records of any such project existed in official archives. When researchers inquired at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, they were told that the designation didn't appear in any surviving naval files. Some historians proposed that Nautilus might have been a code name for one of Germany's late-war technological experiments. Others dismissed it as a misinterpretation of corrosion patterns on the metal, but for many it was too precise to be a coincidence. The recovered material was quietly transferred to a secure research facility for analysis, and for years nothing more was heard of it. But rumors circulated among naval historians and amateur divers that the container had held fragments of plans for an advanced propulsion concept, something involving magneto-hydrodynamic systems, the kind of research that only resurfaced in post-war submarine development decades later. There was also another theory, one that tied U-1206 to the flurry of last-minute Nazi evacuations in 1945. As Allied forces closed in, dozens of U-boats had been sent to sea carrying everything from stolen art to scientific prototypes. A few even tried to reach South America, some never seen again. What if U-1206 had been one of them? And if so, why was it operating so close to Scotland instead of attempting the long southern escape route? The British authorities downplayed the discovery, insisting it was of limited historical importance, but internal reports suggested otherwise. Several files connected to the investigation were classified for another 50 years, an unusual move for what was supposedly a routine recovery of wartime debris. For the local community, the story only deepened the mystery. Fishermen continued to pull up small metallic fragments marked with serial numbers that didn't appear in standard U-boat production lists. Divers who returned to the wreck claimed that parts of it had shifted, as if sections had been removed or disturbed since the initial surveys of the 1980s. Some even alleged that a discreet salvage operation had taken place, at night under naval supervision. What exactly was taken from the wreck remains unknown, but those who saw the recovered container believed it had carried something more valuable than any technological component, something that authorities didn't want discussed publicly. Was it a piece of lost research? A data cache from a secret weapons program? Or evidence of something even more unusual? An attempt to smuggle forbidden material out of Europe before the Third Reich's fall? Whatever it was, the truth was once again sealed, this time not beneath the sea, but behind locked archives. By the time U-1206 was rediscovered in the late 20th century, only a handful of its original crew were still alive. Most had lived quiet, unremarkable lives after the war, blending back into the ordinary rhythm of post-war Germany. For decades, few had spoken publicly about the incident. Officially, their submarine had sunk due to a technical malfunction involving onboard sanitation. It was an explanation so absurd that even historians joked about it. But as researchers began reaching out to the survivors in the 1980s and 1990s, a more complicated picture started to emerge. Karl Adolf Schlitt, the captain, had given his own brief account shortly after the war. He described the accident as a simple mechanical error, a misunderstanding of the pressure valve system. But his testimony, preserved in British naval archives, contained contradictions. He stated that the flooding began in the forward compartment, whereas other survivors insisted it had started in the aft section near the engineering deck. More importantly, Schlitt mentioned an unexplained minor electrical explosion before the gas spread, a detail that was never included in the official report. When asked by interrogators if the submarine had been carrying any special equipment or material, Schlitt's answer was vague. "There were items loaded in Norway," he said, "not our usual supplies. Crates marked as technical." When pressed for more detail, he claimed ignorance, insisting the crates were sealed under orders from Kiel. After his release from captivity, Schlitt avoided interviews. He died in 2009, leaving behind only fragments of his story. But two other crewmen, both engineers, gave later interviews that shed light on what might have really happened inside the boat. The first was Heinrich Weller, a machinist. In a taped interview from 1988, he recalled an unusual atmosphere aboard U-1206 before departure. "There were people on board I didn't know," he said. "Not regular sailors. They came aboard in Norway with officers from the dockyard. They stayed in the aft compartment, always locked the door." Weller also described crates being loaded under supervision of men wearing civilian coats, not the standard naval gray. He claimed one of the engineers joked that the boxes contained the new power plant, but no one was allowed to check. The second testimony came from radio operator Dieter Weber, who survived the sinking and captivity. In a letter sent to a historian in 1994, Weber confirmed that they had received coded transmissions on April 10th and 11th, messages that were to be decoded only by the captain himself. He also mentioned an experimental radio set installed on board shortly before departure, one capable of transmitting on unusually low frequencies. "They told us it was for testing underwater communication," he wrote, "but the captain was told not to use it unless ordered." If true, these details suggested U-1206 was not a routine patrol submarine at all. It might have been part of a late-war test program, possibly connected to the rumored Project Nautilus designation found on the recovered plates decades later. Official naval archives remained silent on the subject, but independent researchers began tracing a trail of circumstantial evidence. In March 1945, just weeks before U-1206 sailed, the German Navy had issued a directive for several boats to participate in special operations of technological importance. Two of those vessels, U-234 and U-873, were later found carrying advanced radar equipment, prototype jet components, and even uranium oxide bound for Japan. It was entirely possible that U-1206 had been assigned a similar mission. The difference was that it never made it beyond the North Sea. By the late 1990s, speculation grew that the so-called toilet accident might have been a convenient cover story. If the submarine had been carrying classified material, scientific documents, or even early nuclear research, the Allies would have had every reason to suppress that information. The British Admiralty had a long history of sealing wartime intelligence findings for decades under the Official Secrets Act. Still, historians faced a problem. There was no proof. The wreck lay silent, the documents destroyed, and the few surviving witnesses either dead or unwilling to speak. But among the veterans' community, a few whispers persisted. Some said that after the crew was rescued, they were not taken directly to standard POW camps, but to a separate facility in northeast Scotland for interrogation. There, British intelligence officers questioned them for weeks before transferring them to regular detention. Those interrogation records remain missing. In the absence of clear evidence, U-1206's story hovered between fact and myth, a tale of engineering failure on the surface and something far more secret beneath it. Then, in 2003, a declassified intelligence memo surfaced in the British National Archives. Dated May 1945, it referenced one recovered U-boat of special interest, location Scotland. No name was given. The attached notes mentioned technical salvage pending and material under naval custody, transferred to Section 6. Section 6 was the wartime code for MI6. The discovery of the declassified intelligence memo in 2003 changed the way historians viewed the sinking of U-1206. Until that point, the submarine had been treated as a curiosity, a symbol of German engineering gone wrong, its end immortalized in an almost comedic footnote about an ill-fated toilet. But the memo, dated May 1945, referred to a recovered German submarine of special interest. Its location matched where U-1206 had gone down. More telling were two lines typed in faint ink near the bottom of the page. Cargo and onboard apparatus transferred to Section 6 personnel, Aberdeen Sector. Subsequent materials marked for Operation Eclipse. Operation Eclipse was not a salvage mission. It was the code name for the British intelligence sweep through northern Germany designed to secure technology, scientists, and documents before the Americans or Soviets could reach them. If the British had classified U-1206's wreck under the same operation, it meant the submarine was carrying something far more valuable than any standard equipment. What that cargo was, however, remains buried in obscurity. Researchers who followed the paper trail found several oddities. The Admiralty's official file on U-1206, catalogued as ADM 199/2563, ends abruptly in mid-1946. Pages are missing, specifically those that were supposed to list recovered items from the wreck. A handwritten note on the final surviving page reads simply, "See Annex B, retained for intelligence purposes." Annex B has never been found. At the same time, British defense reports from 1946 mention the sudden appearance of several German-origin marine components being tested at the Marine Experimental Establishment in Felixstowe. Among these were advanced acoustic systems, hull insulation panels designed to reduce sonar detection, and turbine modifications for quieter operation. Some of these technologies were years ahead of what the Royal Navy had at the time. One engineer later remarked that it was as if someone had handed us blueprints from the future. That same year, Britain began rapid development on what would become its post-war submarine program, boats that incorporated design principles strikingly similar to late-war German U-boat prototypes. The timing was no coincidence, but the coincidences didn't end there. In 1947, during the early Cold War, several declassified intelligence cables show that American and British naval engineers had been jointly studying recovered hydrodynamic magnetic conversion materials. The technology, labeled as Origin Unspecified, was described as having potential applications in propulsion. None of it ever reached production, at least not publicly. Some historians believe these experiments may have stemmed directly from material recovered from the wreck of U-1206. The supposed Project Nautilus plates found decades later in Scottish waters matched the kind of research Germany had been pursuing in secret during the war. Early magneto-hydrodynamic concepts, the theoretical precursor to silent field-driven propulsion systems. If true, it meant the submarine's malfunction might have been caused not by a plumbing error, but by something far more serious, a failed test involving an unproven system. A retired British naval engineer named George Henshaw, who worked at the Admiralty Research Laboratory in the 1950s, gave an interview shortly before his death in 2008. He claimed that during his training, he had seen a file labeled U-1206, Special Salvage Material. "I wasn't allowed to open it," he said, "but I remember one thing. It was marked Category Red. That meant it involved foreign technology under direct intelligence control." Henshaw's recollection matched another rumor from within the diving community, that sometime in the early 1950s, Royal Navy divers had quietly returned to the site of U-1206 under an operation with no official record. Local fishermen recalled seeing unmarked ships anchored offshore for several days, their decks covered and guarded. No one was told why. If anything was recovered, it was never announced. By then, the Cold War had begun. Both superpowers were desperate for any technological edge, and German research, especially in the fields of propulsion, materials science, and acoustics, was being mined by every intelligence agency. The idea that a forgotten wreck in the North Sea could contain remnants of that research was reason enough to keep it quiet. But the question remained. If the submarine had indeed been carrying classified material, why had the official story of its demise been reduced to an absurd anecdote about a faulty toilet? Perhaps that was the point. A story so ridiculous that no one would look further. As the years passed, U-1206 faded again into obscurity. its truth buried beneath layers of myth and secrecy. But in 2012, nearly 70 years after its sinking, a new expedition returned to the site, equipped with high-resolution sonar and remote vehicles. What they found on the seabed would add one final chilling twist to the legend of the ghost submarine. The 2012 expedition was supposed to be routine. A team of marine archaeologists from the University of Aberdeen, partnered with the Royal Navy's Heritage Division, planned to conduct a digital survey of wartime wrecks along Scotland's northeast coast. Among them was the long-forgotten U-1206, resting nearly 300 feet below the surface. They didn't expect to find anything unusual, just rusting steel and sea life. But what their sonar equipment revealed sent ripples through the entire project. The wreck appeared almost exactly where naval records placed it, but the structural damage didn't match the old reports. Instead of a hull torn open by flooding, the imagery showed the pressure hull intact across most of its length. The break that had supposedly doomed the submarine was missing. At first, the team assumed a mapping error. Then, when the ROV descended and its lights swept across the wreck, they saw it clearly. Large portions of the submarine were in remarkably good condition. The outer casing had collapsed, but the internal hull, particularly the engine section, seemed sealed, as if reinforced. More strangely, one section appeared to have been welded shut. ROV pilot Simon Griffiths described it later. You could see clear bead lines across the seams, clean, straight, precise. Not from the 1940s. Someone welded it later. The discovery caused confusion. Underwater welding technology capable of that precision didn't exist during the war, and yet these welds were unmistakably deliberate. They sealed what had once been access hatches leading to the aft compartment, the same area where survivors had once said strangers had been quartered. When the ROV attempted to scan the compartment with sonar, it returned anomalous readings. The interior was partially filled with sediment, but the density suggested there were objects inside, dense, metallic shapes consistent with storage containers or machinery. The team immediately reported their findings, but within days, the Royal Navy's Salvage Authority intervened. The area was reclassified as a restricted heritage site, and further dives were postponed pending safety assessment. The researchers were told not to release footage until the review was completed. 3 months later, the project's funding was quietly withdrawn. One of the divers, speaking anonymously years later, admitted they had captured more footage before the shutdown. "We got close enough to the welds to read markings," he said. "There were numbers, not German serials. They looked British, post-war British." That claim reignited every conspiracy surrounding the submarine. If true, it suggested that the British, or another agency, had returned to the wreck decades earlier, possibly during the unrecorded operation in the 1950s. But what were they sealing inside? Historians offered 3 competing theories. The first was practical, that the Navy had simply sealed hazardous material, perhaps explosives or chemical waste, to prevent leaks. The second was historical, that sensitive remains, maybe classified instruments from the war, had been encased for preservation. The third theory was more troubling, that the sealed compartment contained something recovered and later returned, something that should never have been found in the first place. In 2015, leaked correspondence between the Ministry of Defence and the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency appeared to confirm that unknown metallic materials of foreign origin had been documented in sonar surveys near the wreck. The documents were heavily redacted, but one phrase stood out in plain text. "Containment appears stable. Recommend no further intervention." By then, the wreck had become an obsession for amateur historians and divers. Some tried to reach it illegally, but the North Sea currents made the site treacherous. A few succeeded, bringing back low-quality images that showed little beyond rust and shadow. But one still frame, circulated on an online forum in 2017, showed something that shouldn't have been there, a faint glow reflecting from inside one of the broken panels. The diver who uploaded it claimed it wasn't artificial light, that his equipment had been turned off when he captured it. Scientists dismissed the claim as digital artifacting. Others weren't so sure. By the time the debate faded, the government had extended the restricted zone around the site to half a nautical mile. The wreck of U-1206 was now off-limits to all civilian expeditions. The official reason? Environmental preservation. But to those who'd seen the data, that explanation didn't hold. They knew the truth was something else, something that had been quietly welded shut beneath 300 feet of water, hidden under decades of denial. And if the rumors were right, whatever lay inside that sealed compartment had been placed there, not by the men who built U-1206, but by the men who found it. By the time the last restrictions were placed on U-1206's wreck, most of the men connected to it were long gone. The war that had created it had faded into history and the world had moved on, but the questions surrounding that submarine refused to die. In the years that followed the 2012 expedition, a handful of researchers kept digging through archives and military documents. Among them was Dr. Ian Marshall, a naval historian who spent a decade piecing together fragments of evidence that spanned from wartime Kiel to Cold War Scotland. In 2019, he published a paper that quietly reignited global attention. According to Marshall, several British and American patents filed between 1946 and 1951 contained technical diagrams almost identical to those rumored to have been part of Project Nautilus, the supposed codename linked to U-1206. They described early experiments in silent propulsion, power distribution through magnetic fields, and hull materials designed to absorb radar and sonar waves, concepts far beyond what either Navy officially possessed in 1945. More intriguingly, a 1947 report from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships referenced electrohydrodynamic field tests utilizing foreign materials obtained via British transfer. No specific source was listed, only that the material came from a submerged recovery operation. Marshall believed that phrase was the final clue, an indirect reference to the U-1206 salvage. If true, it meant parts of the submarine, or its mysterious cargo, had been quietly shipped across the Atlantic to become part of post-war American research. And then there was the other trail, the human one. Several of the engineers associated with late-war German marine research vanished after 1945. Some, like Dr. Ernst Heinke, who had worked on experimental turbine systems at Kiel, were listed as missing. But a declassified CIA document from 1952 revealed that Heinke had been relocated to the United States under Operation Paperclip, working for a defense contractor in Connecticut. His area of study? Hydrodynamic energy conversion. By now, it was clear that the story of U-1206 was far more than a tragic accident. It was a fragment of a much larger narrative, one that stretched from the dying days of the Third Reich to the dawn of the atomic and Cold War era. Even the simplest details no longer seemed reliable. The official explanation that the boat sank because of a toilet malfunction appeared increasingly absurd in light of the evidence. Some historians argued that the story had been a deliberate fabrication, a convenient way to obscure the loss of a classified project and prevent questions from being asked during wartime. The British government never corrected the story. And so, the myth persisted, retold in museums and documentaries as a comical footnote to the chaos of World War II. But deep under the North Sea, the truth lay sealed in steel and salt. When sonar imaging of the wreck was quietly updated in 2021 by the Hydrographic Office, analysts noticed something peculiar. The sediment around the aft compartment, the one with the welded seams, showed faint magnetic anomalies. They didn't match the composition of the submarine's hull. Something inside was emitting a consistent, measurable field. Whatever it was still active. The data was forwarded to the Ministry of Defense and then disappeared from public record. To this day, no one knows what lies sealed inside that compartment. Some believe it's nothing more than corroded machinery, a relic of the war's final chaos. Others suspect it's something more, a failed experiment, an artifact of forbidden research, or perhaps a weapon that never reached completion. The sea keeps its secrets well, and beneath the cold waters off the Scottish coast, U-1206 still rests, silent, intact, and forbidden. Its story began as a farce about a broken toilet, but maybe, just maybe, it ended as something much more unsettling. A reminder that in the closing days of the war, not everything that sank to the bottom stayed buried.